the idea, right, is we want to get as much firepower, if you will, on our side. Let's say we throw all the stuff into, we mix it all together and we're trying to get some depression mitigating concoction together. So let's say our doctor recommends medication. If we were to get on that, right, and then we start, an exercise plan, and that helps us feel better because there's a lot of science there. And maybe, we start going to a few social outings and we make some new friends and whatnot. My pitch to my readers is put as many of those things on your plate or get as many of them into your life as possible and see where that synergy takes you. Those different changes that you make in your life, they're going to come together and influence one another in a positive fashion and take you places that one method alone could not bring you.
Hey guys, welcome back to A Safe Place to Land. We have a lovely guest today, Brian Sachetta, the owner and author of Get Out of Your Head, a brand and book series that seeks to help folks overcome anxiety and depression. Today, we're going to dive into the importance of using a biopsychosocial model framework to treat depression and how small lifestyle changes can make a big impact on mental and physical health. Brian's going to share his own journey living with anxiety and advice he wished he received at the beginning of his journey towards healing. Morning. Hi, Brian. How are you?
Hey, Emily, I'm doing all right. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm super excited for our episode. So yeah, Brian, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and how you kind of begun your mental health journey?
Yes. So I am Brian Sachetta. I am the owner and author of a brand called Get Out of Your Head, which seeks to help folks overcome anxiety and depression. I'm a mental health advocate, blogger, software developer, a bunch of different things, right? And kind of getting into the second part of the question of when did the mental health journey begin? I'd like to say in earnest, it started probably when I was like 17, had my first panic attack. That was my introduction to anxiety and mental health. And when I say introduction, it was a crash course, and it was also like I had no idea what I was doing.
I was going to say that's quite a bit of an introduction there.
Yeah, I had no idea what this stuff was, but that began the journey of me saying to myself, like, hey, as this stuff progresses, as I deal with this more, I'm going to have to find out what it is. I'm going to have to be able to put labels on it and create tools for myself that help me cope moving forward. So, the mental health advocacy piece started probably closer to a decade later as I started writing some blog posts in the mental health space. And then also, I put out my first book on anxiety in that was 2018. So since then have just been kind of writing and blogging and appearing on podcasts and trying to, spread good messages of mental health to people and give them some tools that they can put in their own toolbox.
Wow, I love that so much that you're using your own journey to help others and share those tools that have been helpful for you. I think that's super cool. But what was it like being a 17-year-old boy, navigating the world and then all of a sudden having a panic attack? Were you able to get into counseling or did you have a support system? What did that look like?
Yeah, I don't want to say that I blame myself, but there was a lot in any situation. There's a confluence of factors that determine how you evaluate the world and then how you make sense of things moving forward, right? And at 17, I would say both I was not ready to open up to myself and to others about what I was experiencing. And again, it's not a self blame, but it's a recognition that I was holding myself back because I wasn't willing to go there to talk about things. But the other piece, too, to be totally honest, right, that was 2007, I believe. And the mental health space just and the conversation around it was not where it is today.
Right.
So there was not as much information out there. There weren't as many books. There weren't as many influencers. It was harder to find that information. Not that it was impossible, but, today it's like
it's on your fingertips.
Exactly. And on Google and Amazon, like every keyword is bidded for and all the information is really well compartmentalized and whatnot. Back then, it was more of the wild, wild west where, because I didn't have the information at my disposal to say that was a panic attack, I was just like, I was so ridiculously nervous. And that's all I know how to describe it as. It was harder for me to then go on the internet and go down the right path to then find, let's say a self-diagnosis or something similar.
Yeah, that sounds like incredibly difficult to not really know what was going on. And so, like, what steps did you take to start learning about mental health?
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of a brute force, like, combination of continuing to live my life and see where things took me, And then also just looking for information on the internet. I would download an ebook here and there. I would download or I'd buy like a book on tape, and it was much
Gotcha.
harder, right? Where it was like
Yeah.
you might get an actual CD that you had to put into your computer or an
What is
external
that? I don't
drive.
even know what that is.
Yeah, and you could rip it onto iTunes or whatever, put it in your library, but it's so different than today where,
Yeah.
you can go onto Amazon, you can buy the 10 best-selling mental health audiobooks, you can download them in 5 seconds and then you can be listening to them on 2x speed
Yeah.
immediately, right? Whereas
Right.
before then there was just so many more physical barriers of
Gotcha.
getting something sent to you physically in the mail and,
Right.
it was just a different age of technology.
So very self-taught, I didn't know if you started going to therapy, going to group therapy, or having a mentor or anything like that, but it sounds like this was a very independent journey for you.
Yeah, a good amount of white knuckling, and I would say that like I don't say that to recommend that to folks who are
Yeah,
listening,
guys,
right?
don't do that.
I would not do that, and some of why I started writing was to help people understand that, right? To be like, hey, I did it this way. If I could go back and do it differently, I would,
Right.
but my journey is my journey. And now that I have that information, I'm like, okay, to all my listeners, readers, whoever, this is how it went for me. These are the tools that I came up with along the way. Take these tools now. Don't white knuckle it for 10 years. Don't brute force it.
Yeah.
Don't try to
Yeah.
figure it out on your own. No, I'm not saying you can't or that you absolutely shouldn't, but that's
We
just a
don't
harder,
recommend it.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
a harder way to do it. And there are better ways.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of goes into the next, part of our discussion, looking at that biopsychosocial model and taking in so many different parts and pieces to begin your healing journey. And so, can you talk a little bit about what that looks like?
Yeah. So if we just step back and talk about like what is the biopsychosocial model, right? So there's a lot of different lenses or frameworks or ways that we could look at anything that we deal with in the world, but also like diseases, right? So if we put a definition on the biopsychosocial model, it's a framework for looking at, evaluating, possibly treating various diseases. So one of the diseases, quote unquote, that people look at through this lens is depression. And so the the biopsychosocial model, like what it to get into the brass tacks of it, right? It is a framework, but then what are the components of the framework? So it's basically a portmanteau of three different words. So you've got bio, which is biological, psycho, which is psychological, and then social, which is just social. And so the idea, right, is that other frameworks may say, right, that like disease is a product of the body and that's it. And so you treat the body in order to treat the disease. Whereas
Right.
through the lens of the biopsychosocial model, you would say there is the biological component, the psychological, and the social components.
Mhm.
And so if we want to treat depression through, the teachings of this model, we will treat all of those three components. And so to give you just a high level overview, right? If we say, what are some of the biological components of depression? How do we look at those? How do we treat those? You may say, okay, your genetics, right? You may be predisposed to depression. Maybe the way that you use your body. Do you exercise? Do you not exercise? Do you eat well? Do you not eat well? Your neurotransmitter activity. So in theory, right, you could say if you have a chemical imbalance in the brain, then maybe a psychiatrist or a therapist would say, let's get you on a specific medication, and that might treat that imbalance. That's the biological piece. The psychological piece is more your thoughts, your beliefs, your attitudes. How do you make sense of the world in your own mind? And so, if we were approaching that specific bucket, we may do some a deep dive into your own cognition and say, okay, you are evaluating these different things in the world and seeing them through a negative light. And so, maybe if you talk to yourself in a more empowering and positive fashion, maybe that will help you see the world differently and better cope with these things that you come across. And then finally, the social bucket is kind of just everything else, right? So it's your friends, your family members, where do you live? How did you grow up? What is your job like? And so a bit of a catch all, unfortunately, but it's like looking at all those other factors in your life and saying, hey, like, and I kind of like to put things bluntly sometimes. It's like, to be totally frank, right? It's like, if you don't like your job, if you don't like your friends, if you have struggles in your family, and let's just say I'm not trying to be like hurt here, but it's like let's just say your pet just passed away, right? It's like it would make sense that your body would react to all these stressors in a negative fashion, and maybe such a negative fashion that you fall into a depressive state, right? So it's there's one like sometimes people will say in the industry or in the field, they'll be like, okay, so you're depressed, but all these horrible things just happened to you. Let's not forget that even though depression is difficult and we don't want to deal with it, it is also a natural response to some stressors, right?
Exactly.
Given the right concoction, it can just come up. And so sometimes we have to deal with those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you just described that so perfectly, and how important it is to address all of those different issues and not just focus solely on one, because we're dynamic and we are affected by all of those different parts and pieces. And especially as a clinician, I definitely want to look at each and every part of that when I'm making a treatment plan for somebody, because if you're not sleeping and you're not eating, and it's like working on the thoughts isn't really going to change much if that's not changing, and if your environment's not great, we need to address that as well. And so we also call that like a holistic perspective and wanting to take in all of those things. And so it seems as though through your journey of learning, you've realized how important it is to look at it through that lens. Maybe talk a little bit about what you talk about in your book about the biopsychosocial model and helping people with depression.
Yeah. So in addition to everything that I just said, right, there's a key piece that I talk about in the book, which is the fact that the biological, psychological, and social buckets of our lives are not they're not silos, right? They
Hmm.
are sort of interwoven roads in our lives, right, or in our psychology. And so, like, what I really mean by that is they all affect one another. And so when we say, hey, and I'm not picking on psychiatrists or therapists or anything like that, but I think that we can state that, like, our in society today, right, our first inclination is to say, hey, here are some pills, right, here's medication, try this. And I'm not saying that, like, that's a bad approach, but what I am saying is that if we only focus on that, then we're missing out on a confluence of factors that could come together
Absolutely.
to create a synergy to help us even more, right?
Hmm.
So the thought might be that, hey, if you get on a medication plan and you start to feel better, you may then look around and say, oh, I now, because I feel better and I'm seeing things differently, I'm having this awareness to understand that maybe I don't like my job and maybe this is a source of stress. And then all of a sudden, because you feel a little bit better, you feel a little bit more empowered or courageous, or you feel like you have a little bit more agency, right, to then make changes in that social bucket. And then as you make changes in that social bucket, all of a sudden you're starting to feel better,
Hmm.
you're starting
Hmm.
to think better, you're saying
Hmm.
you might even, because you have this evidence in front of you of things improving, you may then be changing your beliefs subconsciously. And when you previously held the belief of saying everything's terrible, nothing's ever going to change, you now have this concrete evidence in front of you and you're like, things are changing, things are
Change is
improving,
possible. Yeah.
it is possible, right? And then all of a sudden, it's this snowball effect where it starts gaining steam and rolling down the mountain, and all of a sudden, positivity leads to more positivity, leads to more positivity. So, what I like to say to folks, right? I know I obviously started with what might sound like a negativity towards medication, but what I say to folks in the book is, I'm not against any one method. I'm against focusing solely on one method. The idea, right, is we want to get as much firepower, if you will, on our side. Let's say we throw all the stuff into, we mix it all together and we're trying to get some depression mitigating concoction together. So let's say our doctor recommends medication. If we were to get on that, right, and then we start an exercise plan, and that helps us feel better because there's a lot of science there. And maybe we start going to a few social outings and we make some new friends and whatnot. My pitch to my readers is, put as many of those things on your plate, or get as many of them into your life as possible, and see where that synergy takes you, because those different changes that you make in your life, they're going to come together and influence one another in a positive fashion and take you places that one method alone could not bring you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you were able to share that message. And we say a lot, of the work that happens in therapy is actually outside of the office. And so if you're coming here once a week for 1 hour, let's think about how many hours are in your week. And if you're showing up here for 1 hour and we're talking about your thoughts and we're trying to reframe them, and then you walk out of the door, but you're not changing, your lifestyle changes, you're not going out and socializing, you're not taking that next step to go see a psychiatrist and get on medication, it's like, how much change can we actually see if we're only talking about your thoughts and feelings for 1 hour in your whole entire week? And so I definitely like to promote, medication and therapy at the same time so you can use the tools while you're making those adjustments. because like you said, we're kind of missing the mark if we're just, suggesting medication for people, but not teaching them the tools to use while they're starting that medication.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really important subject. I think sometimes the comparison that I make, right, is obviously it's much different than therapy, but if you said I want to go learn a particular skill, right? You wouldn't just read a book on the subject, read it for an hour a day or an hour a week, and then expect to go be an expert, right? You need to
Right.
take that knowledge and then go apply it in your everyday life. And so when you talk about, hey, go to therapy for an hour a week, but then also make changes in your life, that's how you gain any skill. That's how you make any change, right? So it's really important that we don't lose sight of that.
Yeah, absolutely. We really need to exercise and use those muscles to be able to start making a new routine and creating a new life. And that's another big part of it too, is even when we start using these tools and making some changes, it's not gonna be a quick fix. We're not gonna see results immediately. And it's two step forwards and one step back. And we're just continuing to learn what works for us and what doesn't work for us. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the changes that were super impactful for you personally.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of so on the depression front, right? A lot of what we have talked about thus far was really helpful for me understanding how these things come together and how multiple having multiple irons in the fire, if you will, is really critical. Another thing that has been helpful for me is kind of understanding, right? So I talk about in my second book, which is the book focused on depression. I talk about how you could make the argument, and I do make the argument that depression is a disease of the modern lifestyle, right? And
Mm.
that's not to say that like folks who like zero people who let's say like zero Amish people, right? Folks who are not living a quote unquote modern lifestyle. Let me just make sure I phrase it correctly because I'm kind of piecing sentences together. But
No, you're
it's not
good.
it's not to say that zero Amish people have experienced depression, right? Obviously, some of them do. And so it's not to say that it is solely a disease of the modern lifestyle, but is certainly perpetuated in a great fashion by the way that we live our lives these days, right? And so a lot of the
Absolutely.
work, like, if you go down the psychology route for long enough, I think you eventually get back to something like evolutionary psychology and you're trying to figure out like where these mechanisms in our brains and bodies came from, right? So one of the examples that people give in terms of anxiety is like you go back to the savannah, right? So when I couldn't even tell you what year that was, but let's just say hundreds of thousands of years ago, when our species lived in the wild and we're trying to outrun predators and whatnot, you would say, okay, from an evolutionary psychology lens, there are different behaviors and processes that we run in our minds or that our bodies run subconsciously that help us survive and stay alive long enough to pass our genes to offspring, right? And so we think about, okay, if that is the case, then we can backtrack and say, what are some of the things that kept us alive and therefore were beneficial for our survival? And we look at, being in a predatory environment where, let's just say there's bears that are trying to attack us on a daily basis. The fact that, and it's kind of, we can only really think, can only really evaluate this in hindsight, but we could say, okay, so when you're in front of a bear, right, the fact that your body revs up and puts you in a fight or flight state and gets you moving, allows you to move your body in some fashion, whether it's it's fight, flight, or freeze. It's your body is sending you, your mind and your nervous system are sending you the messages to say you need to do something to
Mhm,
escape this predator, right? And
mhm,
so the theory is that those that weren't as good at that or didn't have as active of a fight or flight system, they may not have survived and passed their genes on to offspring. And so the fact that our nervous system's revved up, or for those of us whose nervous systems revved up really quickly in the face of these threats, that became a real boon to our longevity. And so that's one example of sort of evolutionary psychology and thinking about like, okay, so today we all still get revved up on a daily basis, but we don't face as many bears, so to speak, right? We have these
mhm.
proverbial bears on our calendars, these sort of metaphorical ones. However, our brains and our bodies are still running these internal algorithms, if you
Yeah,
will. And so it's
yeah.
like we now have to say, okay, if you take that sentence or that idea and you say, okay, well, it would make sense now that a lot of us experience anxiety because what happens is we're still running these algorithms and yet there's no bears in front of us. So it's very hard for us to, there's nothing for us to run away from. And so our bodies are just continually, in
Mhm.
these stressful environments from which we cannot run away. they are still running these algorithms and being like,
Right.
find safety, find safety, find safety, and we can't. So what ends up happening is we run these patterns in our minds. We think negative thoughts. We get, worried about what's going to happen a week from now, and that becomes sort of what anxiety is. So from an evolutionary standpoint, it almost you can, trace all the steps back like I just did and say, okay, it makes sense as to how we got to anxiety today. If I go, if I know that was a long ramble there, but it's like if we then take that sort of thinking and look at depression, we could say, all right, there were also some behaviors that were rewarded in the sense of as we did them, we stayed alive longer.
Mhm.
And we're incentivized to stay alive longer to pass our genes on to offspring. And so on the depression front, there are probably also some behaviors that we did that kept us alive, that then promoted, the passing of genes onto offspring. And so if you think about it, you're like, all right, we would want to engage in those behaviors so that way in today's world, we also live long enough to have kids and see our lineage start to create and all that. So, you go back in time and you say, what were some of the behaviors that kept us alive, that were incentivized, that, whether it's subconsciously or consciously, our bodies were like, I want you to do these things, right? And
Mhm.
so the research would show that like some of these subjects or some of the actions that we can take. So it was advantageous, right? We stayed alive longer when we got a lot of exercise, and we still do, right? Obviously, when we are surrounded by other people, having face to face conversations,
Mhm.
being in small and tightly knit communities where we're
Right.
able to have close connections with other people. I guess some of the other ones, right? Just like having an understanding or a faith in God or the universe or a higher power, and feeling as though there's some meaning to your life.
Belonging and meaning, yeah.
Exactly. And so all of that is to kind of bring it back around and say, all right, so if depression is a disease of the modern lifestyle, then like how have we strayed from some of those actions
Mhm.
in our world today? And I'm probably going to forget some of them because I just rattled them off, but it's like, let me just recap some of them, and maybe they won't all map to what I just said, but it's like the current way that we live our lives, right? It's like even on nice days, we're inside most of the time, right? We're either in our cars, we're on the train, we're in the office, we're in the house, so we're not outside getting a lot of exercise, we're not getting a lot of sunlight. We're sitting down, at our desks, on couches, in front of screens. We're more isolated than we've ever been before. We're not
Mhm.
connecting with as many people face to face. We
Mhm.
don't even have as many tightly knit relationships as we used to. There are
Right.
studies showing that people are more lonely than they have ever been before. We don't
Mhm.
eat very well. We eat a lot of processed garbage. And so you take all of, I could go on and on, right? It's like advanced warfare and AI and scary things. You take all those subjects and you say, okay, we are living very differently than our bodies want us to live. And so
Right.
maybe the product of that is our neurotransmitter activity gets messed up. We don't have those relationships that we're looking for. So we're not giving our bodies what they need. And in
Mhm.
response, they're reacting being, they're like, hey, if you're not going to provide me the things that I'm seeking you to provide, then I need to get your attention in some fashion. And one of those fashions is depression, right? To be like, look, I need you to reevaluate your entire
Mhm.
life.
Mhm.
And the only way that I can get you to do that is to make you feel horrible, right? And so my
Right.
argument is that if we live differently, right? So going back and saying depression is a disease of the modern lifestyle, right? I'm not saying that we should go back to the savannah because life would be really hard and scary and difficult
Right.
there. But I'm kind of like, let's try to mix, the old and the new and give our
Mhm.
bodies what they need, what we used to give them much more often, when we lived in the wild, and combine them with the beauties of modern life and say, okay, we can still live long and prosper and have these fun, technology or luxury driven lifestyles, but we also need to supplement them with a proper diet, getting good exercise, having, those tight connections in communities, and having tight relationships, making sure that we're not isolated on a regular basis, so on and so forth. So it was a long ramble there, but yeah, that's one of the main takes I have in the book is saying to folks like, look, the way that we are living our lives, myself included, is having a large impact on our mental health and specifically on depression.
Yeah, absolutely. And essentially, you're saying, let's just get back to the basics. Like, at our core, we're just humans. And I love to say, we're just complicated house plants. Like, we need water and we need sunlight and we need to just, hang out. And so, this lifestyle that society has created for us, and especially with technology, it is kind of getting in the way of us doing the things that we need to do, essentially. And so, and even me with this knowledge, knowing that these core principles are so important, I try to integrate them into my life, but it is still incredibly difficult as I'm trying to, navigate this world. And so, for our listeners out there, like, you're not the only ones who struggle. I'm sure, Brian, you still struggle today making sure you get those necessities. What has helped you kind of keep that routine? Do you have any tips that help you, stay off social media or workout routines, community routines?
Yeah, well, I think the in your question, right? The key word is routine, and
Mhm,
making sure that with like we set up our lifestyles, our environments, and our routines such that I'm not going to say guarantee success, but we increase the likelihood of success. So what I mean
mhm,
by that, right, is like, I wear an Apple Watch, and my Apple Watch on a regular basis is making sure that I exercise enough every day, that I get enough active calories or move calories. I also wear a Whoop, and that is telling me what my stress levels are and what my how my sleep performance is on a regular basis. So there is, in the habit formation or the routine space, there are folks who will say, like, make sure that you set up your space, your environment, your house in a way that promotes behaviors that you want to
mm,
engage in. Because the
mhm,
difficulty, right, like we all get so busy that if something is not like glaringly obvious or just already second nature to us, we're going to forget about it. And so, what
mhm,
people will often say, right, is something like, if you want to go to the gym, then don't just hope for it to happen. Before you go to bed that night, put your shoes in front of the door, your sneakers, and then also put your gym clothes on top of that. And then that way, like, in order for you to open the door, you would need to move your sneakers and your gym attire. Sure, you still could, but the likelihood of you seeing that and, then moving the stuff and then being like, I'm going to go do something else are lower. So you're trying to essentially set your lifestyle, your routine up in a way that forces you to engage in the behaviors that you want to engage in. And, you had said, like, Brian, I'm sure you still struggle with this stuff. I absolutely do. And that's the difficulty, right? Going back to the modern lifestyle piece is like, I don't know about you, but modern life is so busy. And, I will say it's very
absolutely.
stressful. And I totally understand. Like, I am coming from a place of like, I live a very nice life and I'm very fortunate. So there's always, it's always tough to make these comparisons because like, I don't have a ton to complain about. At the same time, life just still gets so busy. And, sometimes it's like, I know earlier this year, I was like, I'm going to meditate every day this year. And I was doing really good with that for a while. And then I just moved recently, and that took a ton of time. I underestimated how much time that would take me and all the
Mhm,
work involved. And then I look back and I'm like, oh man, I haven't meditated in like a week and a half. So again, it's setting up your routine in a way that forces you to do this stuff because
yeah.
we get busy. And I'm not saying that we're certainly not stupid, right? But we get so busy that we get distracted from these reminders, and we need to make sure that the reminders are really loud, so that way it's almost foolproof, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think setting realistic expectations is really important, especially as someone is beginning this new journey. You're not going to work out 7 days a week if you haven't worked out in a few years. And so it can be really discouraging too when we set those really high expectations and we're not able to achieve them. I think taking it easy on yourself as well as you're beginning to have these lifestyle changes is super important. And then also, essentially, what we're talking about is rewiring our brain to, allow ourselves to reach for these more positive and helpful and healthy behaviors rather than going for our phone or a bag of chips or self isolating or sleeping all day. It can be incredibly difficult to choose kind of like the better option. But again, the more we do it, the more we are training our brain to say, these things make me feel good and it is worth it.
Yeah, most definitely. It's so hard these days because again, there are so many distractions. We're so busy, and let's be honest, right? Like the world. I'm not trying to be conspiracy theorist or anything like that, but the world is just not really set up for our success. If you think about, right, so you kind of you alluded to the way that we eat or something, right, and it's like you may say, hey, I'm going to lose weight or I'm going to be healthier. And then all of a sudden, like you go to work and everybody's like, hey, we're going to go down to McDonald's or we're going to the burger joint and we're going to, get some lunch. And it becomes difficult to stick with our goals, right? Especially where everywhere you go, there is processed food just looking at you,
Yep.
and then nowadays on social media, right? Some of these some of the restaurants, like their social media accounts are really good. And so you think about like how Wendy's has gotten so creative with its social where, you see these tweets and you're like, honestly, that kind of makes me want to go to Wendy's. So it's difficult. I think, like you said, you need to do things that help you feel better, right? And I think that takes time to figure out.
Mhm.
So, for example, it's like if I would say like in your let's say in your 20s, it's like you have more time, you have more energy, and you are generally just more resilient physically, where you're like, hey, I'm going to go out and drink with my friends every weekend, I'm going to eat whatever I want to eat because I enjoy it. And then as you maybe get a little bit older and I don't know if it's your stamina goes down or whatever, but you start to feel those bags of chips, you start to feel the beers. And so eventually it takes time to figure it out, but you're like, okay, I guess I can't really be eating this way as much because it's really fun in the moment, and then the next week I pay for it, right? I don't sleep as well, I don't feel as well, I don't perform as well in the gym and whatnot. And so, yeah, I think setting yourself up for success becomes, I guess, the positivity piece, right? Is the most important part. There is figure out a way to help yourself feel as good as you can. And so, I'm an engineer, so what I think about all the time is optimization, like, but at a very broad level. So somebody may say like, hey, I ate pizza and I was that was amazing. It tasted so good. I felt so good, whatever. I kind of look at, a more broad or holistic lens where I'm like, yes, I know that I will feel really good when I eat the pizza, but then I know I'm going to pay for it the next week. And so
Mhm.
to me, the feel good piece is not in the moment. It's the entire experience. And that might be
Wow.
several days from now.
Mhm.
So, one thing that I don't know, like people will sometimes say that in terms of like habit creation, and new behaviors that you engage in, it takes a little while, but
It
you
does,
can
yeah.
you can eventually get your body conditioned to almost anything. And so
Right.
I now like I enjoy like when I eat a salad, I like the salad not as much as the pizza, but almost as much in the moment because I've eaten so many of them that I've habituated my body into a certain response, right? And part of that is knowing that in the next hour, in the next day, in the next week, I'm going to feel better as a result of that decision. And so, you know, to folks, what I say actually in the second, my second book, the book on depression, is I'm talking about in the book in the specific chapter that I'm referencing. I talk about leaning into discomfort, doing things that you don't feel so good in the moment and whatnot. And I guess how I end that chapter is by saying basically what I just said was knowing that your body is eventually going to become habituated to anything that you do. So it might take a little while, right? You're not going to enjoy CrossFit the first time that you do it.
Absolutely
However,
not. Yeah.
you go online and there are CrossFit fanatics all around the world. And to somebody who doesn't like CrossFit, they're going to be like, these people are crazy. How can you
Literally.
possibly like CrossFit, right?
Literally.
But you do it enough times, you get, the dopamine rush of being in a community with other people. And a month later, a year later, your body craves it. And then the next thing you know, you love CrossFit. And so
Yeah.
to me, like what I'm saying to folks is find the things that are somewhere in the middle of like, they're good for you. And they're also not so painful that you would never, ever want to do them. Find those things that kind of meet that intersection. That way you are more willing to take them up in the first place and stick with them to get to that long-term benefit of feeling, having that habituation and wanting to engage in those activities in the long run.
That just made so much sense because I'm a big runner, and every time I tell someone I like running, they're like, "You're crazy. Running is insane." But it does probably sound insane if you've never enjoyed doing it before. But to me, I'm like addicted to it. I love it and it feels great. And so, yeah, finding something that is doable for someone's body and something that, they can realistically achieve. But again, it's going to take time before we get that, those feel good feelings. And I like what you said about our body can pretty much accommodate to anything. It's like people who stop eating sugar, eventually one day you stop craving it. And the thought of sweets kind of is unsettling. Whereas in the past, you were going for the donuts every day. And so I think that's just awesome of how the human body can, acclimate and change and really make those adjustments for us and make those decisions easier for us. And also, you've really changed your whole thought process about food. You're kind of looking at it as food is fuel, it's not just for pleasure. And I believe when we change how we think about things, optimizing our sleep and taking care of ourselves, isn't selfish. I hear that a lot with my clients, believing that taking time to read or meditate or journal is almost selfish because they want to do things for their kids and get an extra, assignment done for their job. But essentially, what we're saying is it's not selfish and it is actually necessary if you want to prevent burnout, anxiety, and depression. And so, our culture is all about, what can you do? What can you produce? What can you do for others? But really, we have to kind of check in and say, am I taking care of myself? Again, back to the basics, back to the essentials, because it's really not optional. And that's what I'm really trying to get across as well. These things are necessary, or we're going to feel it in the end. Like you said, we're going to have struggles in old age and diseases and all the things.
Yeah, and there's a notion in the self-help world. There's even a couple books with like this in the title. They'll say put on your own oxygen mask first before assisting others. The thought, right? Like I'm it's kind of crude or whatever if I say it this way, but the thought is like if there's not a lot of oxygen on the plane and you have 3 kids with you on the plane that can't put their own oxygen masks on, if you try to put theirs on and then you run out of oxygen and you pass out, they're definitely not going to get their masks on, right? So get yours on first and quickly, and then all of a sudden, like you have enough oxygen to make everything else happen that you need to happen. So obviously,
Exactly.
when you talked about like selfishness or whatever, right? There's a balance there. If I'm a parent and I am neglecting my kid, there's a point at which the scale tips into selfishness. However, to your point, if you are not doing like if you are so burned out and so tired, that is going to have an effect on your kid. You're not going to be able to, and it's not just children,
No
right?
frustration tolerance, it's going to start spilling out everywhere.
Exactly. So it could almost be the opposite of selfishness, where it's like I need to do this so that way I don't take out my frustration on my kid, or
Exactly.
I have the patience with them to instill good values in them and be a good parent and whatnot. So all this stuff is a balance, but it is funny where sometimes the opposite of what we think is going to happen can happen, and we have to be
Yeah.
careful with that.
Yeah, and it's hard. And I think something I want to say too is like it is a luxury to have time to meal prep. It is a luxury to have time to work out and to read and to journal and to meditate. It isn't always feasible with our lifestyles, especially, for our folks out there who are married and have kids, or if you're running a business. We understand, the difficulties of it. But again, it's the tiny small changes that we can try to integrate into our life to better ourselves. And so yeah, I think this was a super great topic to talk about.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, to that last point, right? It's like compound interest. You start with $1, you add a penny, the next day or the next year of whatever time period of accrual. Not only do you get the penny, but you also get 1% of what you've already accrued, right? And so it builds and builds and builds. And so on the front or the topic of like habit creation or habit formation or doing new things and building up, I guess going all the way back to the beginning of the conversation of the biopsychosocial model and the synergy there, right? Is like as you start to change your life, you make one change and then you make another, and there's a synergy there, and then you make another, and there's not only another synergy, but you also have the previous synergy that is building upon itself. And so,
Yeah,
people talk about the downward spiral, but also the upward spiral is really important too. Being able to stack small wins on top of themselves, and eventually they get us to good places if we stick with it.
I love that. That's so beautiful. Well, as we wrap up, Brian, did you want to tell our listeners where they can find your book or your website?
Yeah, so my website is getoutofyourhead.com. There's no dashes, no spaces in that. On the website, you'll find my blog, you'll find links to my books, stuff like that. If you felt so inclined, there's some merch on there. I try to gear people to. But yeah, that's the best place to find me on social media. I tend to post the most on Instagram. The handle there is also Get Out of Your Head. I'm working on a writing project right now, and then once that's done, I hope to do some more marketing stuff. So I'm like, I don't know if I'll delve into TikTok this year or some other avenues for trying to get the message out there. But I guess like for folks that are listening, you might see me in other places as the year goes on.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure having you today.
Thanks, Emily. It was a pleasure over here too.
Thanks so much for spending some time with us here on A Safe Place to Land. Could you do me a favor really quick? Could you leave us a review wherever you are listening to this and subscribe so that you never have to miss an episode whenever we drop it? If at any point in time you're like, man, it would be so cool to work with the team at Sunshine City Counseling. You can always find us at sunshinecitycounseling.com. We serve the state of Florida, and we are located in the downtown community of St. Petersburg, Florida. If you are in or around the Portland, Maine area, you can find us at easternshorecounseling.co. We really believe that every single person is deserving of excellent mental health care. You are not a problem to be solved or fixed. You are a person to be served. We are here for you, so don't hesitate to reach out. Until next time, we'll see you guys later. Bye.